My beloved child. The voice message was never supposed to reach you. That was the first thing that made it different. It had been recorded late, after a suitcase had already been pulled from the closet and left open beside the bed. Clothes were folded badly inside it. A phone charger hung from the wall. A half-empty glass of water sat untouched on the nightstand. Your soulmate had spent nearly 20 minutes staring at your name on their phone before pressing the record button. The first recording lasted 11 seconds. Deleted. The second lasted almost a minute. Deleted again. The third began with silence. Then a shaky breath. And finally, "Please listen before I leave." Their voice cracked before the next sentence could come out. They stopped recording. But this time, they didn't delete it. They sat there with the phone in both hands, shoulders shaking, trying to decide whether sending you the truth would be an act of courage or simply another way of disturbing the peace you had worked so hard to build. Because something had happened earlier that evening. Something that changed the story they had been telling themselves about why you disappeared from their life. And the person who changed that story was the last person they expected. It happened during a small family dinner. Nothing dramatic at first. Plates on the table. A television playing quietly in another room. Someone talking about work. Someone else complaining about traffic. Your soulmate had already told everyone they were leaving town for a while. They framed it casually. A change of scenery. A new opportunity. Maybe a chance to start over. Nobody challenged them until an older family member who had remained unusually quiet asked one simple question. "Are you leaving because of them?" Your soulmate looked up. They knew exactly who was being discussed. You. But they answered quickly. No. Too quickly. The room changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No one raised their voice. But there are moments when one word makes everybody understand that something deeper is being avoided. Your soulmate tried to continue eating. Then the older relative said, "You've been blaming that person for leaving you, but you never told anyone what happened before they left." The fork in your soulmate's hand stopped halfway to the plate. For months, perhaps longer, they had carried a version of the relationship that protected them from one uncomfortable truth. In that version, you became distant. You stopped trying. You changed. You became colder. You eventually walked away. And because you were the one who finally stepped back, it became easier for your soulmate to believe that you were also the one who had broken everything. But that evening, someone finally asked what happened before your distance. What happened before your silence? What happened before you stopped explaining yourself? Your soulmate had no comfortable answer. Because the truth lived in smaller moments. Messages left unanswered until the next day. Plans changed at the last minute. Conversations where you opened your heart and they responded with jokes because seriousness made them uncomfortable. Promises that sounded sincere in the moment but disappeared when consistency was required. Times you asked, gently, whether something had changed. And every time, your soulmate told you some version of "Everything's fine." You knew everything wasn't fine. But eventually, asking became more painful than accepting the silence. At dinner, the relative leaned back in their chair. "I saw them once," they said. Your soulmate frowned. "When?" A few weeks before everything ended. That detail immediately disturbed them. Nobody had mentioned this meeting before. The relative explained that they had unexpectedly crossed paths with you somewhere ordinary. A store. A parking lot. A place where neither of you expected to have a meaningful conversation. They remembered your face because you looked tired. Not angry. Not bitter. Tired. You had asked how everyone was doing. You had smiled politely. And then the relative had asked about your soulmate. There had been a pause. Not long. But long enough to reveal that the question hurt. Then you said something your soulmate had never heard. I care about them. I just don't know how long I can keep feeling alone inside a relationship. The dinner table went silent. Your soulmate's first reaction was defensive. They wanted to say that wasn't fair. They wanted to explain how overwhelmed they had been. How much pressure they were under. How difficult that period of their life had felt. All of those things might have been true. But none of them changed what you had experienced. The older relative continued. They weren't asking me to take sides. Your soulmate looked away. They weren't even angry with you. That somehow hurt more. They sounded like someone who had already tried everything they knew how to try. There it was. The first reversal. Your soulmate had spent so much time remembering the day you stopped reaching out that they had almost forgotten the months when you were the one doing most of the reaching. The problem had never been a lack of feeling. It had been the exhaustion of uncertainty. You could forgive a difficult week. You could understand stress. You could be patient with fear. But you could not keep building emotional safety with someone who disappeared every time vulnerability asked something real from them. Your soulmate left the dinner early. They said they needed air. Outside, they checked their phone without knowing why. Your contact was still saved. They had never deleted it. They opened the old conversation. Scrolled upward. At first, they were looking for proof that their memory was right. Then they found something else. A message from you. Not dramatic. No accusations. Just one sentence. I don't need perfection. I need to know I'm not the only one trying to keep us connected. Your soulmate stared at that line for a long time. They had responded hours later with, sorry. Long day. Nothing else. They kept scrolling. Another message from you appeared several weeks later. If you need space, tell me. I can respect space. What hurts is not knowing whether I'm being loved or quietly pushed away. Their response had been shorter. Don't overthink it. And suddenly an old conversation that once seemed ordinary became almost unbearable to read. Because you had told them what was hurting you. More than once. You had not vanished without explanation. They had simply been emotionally absent while the explanations were happening. They locked the phone. Opened it again. Scrolled farther. That was when they found the voice note from you. They had forgotten it existed. It was only 38 seconds long. Your voice sounded calm. Maybe too calm. You said you cared about them deeply, but you were beginning to lose yourself trying to understand where you stood. You said you didn't want to pressure them. You didn't want to beg. You didn't want love to become a constant test of whether you were important enough to receive basic communication. And at the end, you said, "I hope one day you understand that stepping back isn't the same thing as not caring." Your soulmate listened twice. Then a third time. The person they had accused of leaving had actually been explaining why staying was becoming impossible. That realization followed them home. The suitcase was still open. They had planned to finish packing. Instead, they sat on the floor. And this is where the story changed again. Because leaving town had originally been their attempt to escape reminders of you. They had convinced themselves that distance would finally make the past quieter. New streets. New routines. New people. Less temptation to wonder whether they might run into you. Less chance of hearing your name from someone who remembered the two of you together. But now the move felt different. It no longer looked like escape from you. It looked like another version of the same pattern they had always used when feelings became difficult. Leave. Distract. Start over. Avoid the conversation. Your soulmate looked around the room and realized how often they had confused movement with growth. Changing cities would be easy. Changing behavior would be harder. They picked up the phone. Opened your contact. Started typing. "I heard something about you tonight." Deleted. "I think I finally understand." Deleted. "I owe you an apology." They stared at that one longer. Then deleted it too. Because suddenly they understood something else. An apology written because they were panicking about losing you forever was not automatically proof of change. Fear can make people say beautiful things. Loneliness can create temporary courage. Regret can sound almost identical to transformation in the middle of the night. But you had already heard promises before. You had already seen emotion before. What had been missing was consistency after the emotional moment passed. So your soulmate opened the voice recorder instead. Maybe because hearing their own voice made hiding harder. Maybe because typed words could be polished until responsibility disappeared. The first attempt began. "I don't know if you want to hear this." They stopped. Deleted it. The next one began with an explanation about stress. Deleted. The third attempt included details about how much they had missed you. Deleted again. They finally understood that the message could not begin with what they needed. It had to begin with what they had done. The fourth recording started quietly. "Please listen before I leave." Then. "I found some of our old messages tonight, and I heard something I should have understood a long time ago." A pause. "You didn't disappear on me." Another pause. "I kept disappearing on you." Their breathing changed. Those words were harder than saying, "I miss you." Because missing you did not require accountability. Admitting what happened did. They continued. "You told me you felt alone. I treated it like you were asking for too much. You asked for clarity, and I called it overthinking. You asked me to communicate when I needed space, and instead I made you guess what every silence meant." Their voice began shaking. "I kept telling myself you left because you stopped loving me." They stopped. You could hear movement in the recording. Maybe they stood up. Maybe they covered their face. When they spoke again, their voice was breaking. But I think you left because loving me was starting to cost you your peace. That was when they cried. Not theatrical crying. Not the kind meant to make someone feel guilty. The kind that happens when a person finally hears the truth in their own words. The recording ran for several seconds with nothing except uneven breathing. Then they said, "I don't know what your life looks like now." That sentence mattered. Because once, they might have assumed you were waiting. They might have imagined that your continued love guaranteed continued availability. But time had changed you. The person who once checked the phone constantly no longer built entire evenings around whether someone replied. The person who once explained the same feeling 3 different ways had learned that being understood should not require endless emotional translation. The person who once feared losing the relationship more than losing themselves had started making different choices. Maybe quietly. Maybe without anyone applauding. But those choices changed your emotional posture. You stopped confusing longing with compatibility. You stopped treating inconsistency as evidence of a complicated love story. You learned that someone can care about you and still lack the maturity to care for the relationship properly. And perhaps most importantly, you stopped believing that boundaries were punishments. They became protection for the peace you had worked hard to rebuild. Your soulmate had begun noticing this change indirectly. A mutual acquaintance had mentioned seeing you recently. "You seem different," they had said. Your soulmate immediately asked, "How?" The answer disturbed them. Calmer. Not happier because someone new had appeared. Not colder. Not bitter. Calmer. There was no dramatic story about you spending every day heartbroken. No evidence that your entire life remained emotionally frozen around the past. You had simply begun living without waiting for another person's confusion to become clarity. Your soulmate remembered that word while recording. Calmer. They continued speaking. "I heard you've been doing better." A nervous breath. "I wish I could say hearing that only made me happy." There was another pause. "Part of me was afraid." That confession was more honest than anything else in the recording. Because your healing meant something uncomfortable. It meant they might no longer have unlimited time. Your growth had removed the invisible guarantee that you would always be emotionally available whenever they became ready. They continued. "I think I believed you'd always understand me, no matter how long it took me to understand myself." Their voice softened. That wasn't fair. The message was becoming longer. But for once, they weren't trying to persuade you. They weren't saying the relationship had been perfect. They weren't using destiny as an excuse to avoid responsibility. They weren't promising that love alone would fix what happened. They said, "If you never want to reopen this door, I will respect that." The sentence nearly broke them again. Because love without control requires accepting an answer you may not want. They continued. "I don't want to send this so you feel sorry for me." Then a shaky laugh. "I've done enough making my feelings someone else's responsibility." That was new. Months earlier, your soulmate might have believed emotional pain gave them permission to return suddenly, demand answers, or expect immediate forgiveness. Now they were beginning to understand that remorse does not create entitlement. An apology is something you give. Forgiveness is something the other person decides whether they can offer. Reconciliation is something even more complicated. It requires two people. And neither person should have to betray themselves to create it. The recording became quiet again. Your soulmate looked at the suitcase. I was going to leave tomorrow without saying any of this. Then came the most important admission. I thought leaving would help me move on. But tonight I realized I've been leaving whenever I don't know how to face something. They described the dinner. Not every detail. Enough for you to understand. They told you someone had repeated what you once said about feeling alone. They admitted that their first instinct had been to defend themselves. And then they said, "But I couldn't argue with the messages on my own phone." There was no convenient villain anymore. No friend who ruined things. No terrible misunderstanding that removed responsibility from both of you. There had been fear. Miscommunication. Bad timing. Yes. But there had also been choices. Your soulmate had often chosen avoidance. You had eventually chosen self-respect. Both choices changed the relationship. Then the message took an unexpected turn. They didn't ask you to stop them from leaving. They didn't say, "If you still love me, call me tonight." They didn't put a deadline on your heart. Instead, they said, "I'm still leaving tomorrow." You might expect that sentence to mean the story was over. But listen to what came next. "Not because I'm running from you anymore." Their breathing steadied. "I need to figure out whether I can actually become the kind of person who stays present when things are uncomfortable." They paused. "And I don't think I should ask you to wait while I learn that." This was the biggest reversal. The voice message had begun sounding like a desperate attempt to hold on to you. It was becoming something else. An apology without a trap attached. A confession without a demand. The soulmate who once needed reassurance was beginning to understand that if they truly cared, your freedom had to matter as much as their hope. They continued. "I love what we had." Then corrected themselves. "No. That's not enough." A longer silence. "I loved you. Maybe part of me still does. But I know now that feeling something deeply doesn't automatically mean I knew how to handle it well." The distinction was painful. But mature love requires that distinction. People sometimes believe intensity proves compatibility. It doesn't. Missing someone proves absence hurts. Jealousy proves fear exists. Regret proves the past matters. None of those things automatically prove a relationship is safe enough to rebuild. Your soulmate was finally confronting the harder question. Not, "Do I still love you?" but, "Could I love you without making you carry the weight of my avoidance?" They said, "If we ever speak again, I don't want to tell you I've changed. I want there to be something different enough that you can see it without me selling it to you." That sentence changed the meaning of the whole recording. Because the old version of your soulmate wanted words to repair what behavior had damaged. The person speaking now was beginning to understand that trust returns through evidence. Not speeches. Not tears. Not destiny. Evidence. Showing up when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Saying what is wrong instead of creating distance and expecting the other person to decode it. Making plans carefully. Keeping them. Taking responsibility without immediately adding an excuse. Respecting boundaries even when they hurt. Learning that vulnerability is not the same thing as losing control. The recording was almost finished. Your soulmate sounded exhausted. Not because they had stopped caring. Because pretending had finally become heavier than honesty. Then they returned to the sentence from the beginning. Please listen before I leave. But now the words meant something different. At first, they sounded like panic. Like someone asking to be saved from departure. Now they sounded like a person trying, perhaps for the first time, to leave the truth behind instead of another unanswered question. They said, I don't know if this message changes anything for you. A pause. It doesn't have to. Another. I just needed you to know that I finally understand something I should have understood while you were still standing beside me. Their voice became quieter. You weren't asking me to become somebody else. They swallowed. You were asking me to stop making you feel alone. The sentence hung there. No dramatic music inside the moment. No miracle. No guarantee that two people would suddenly find their way back to one another. Just truth. And truth sometimes arrives too late to restore what existed. But it can still stop the same damage from being repeated. Your soulmate ended the message with something simple. If we never get another chance, I'm sorry I learned this after losing the version of you who kept giving me chances. Then, after several seconds. And if we do ever speak again, I hope I know how to meet the person you've become instead of expecting you to return to the person who kept waiting for me. The recording ended. Their thumb hovered over the send button. This was the final choice. Send it and accept whatever followed. Or delete it and preserve the old pattern one more time. They remembered the dinner. The old messages. Your 38-second voice note. I hope one day you understand that stepping back isn't the same thing as not caring. They finally understood. So they pressed send. And then they did something the old version of them might not have done. They placed the phone face down. No repeated calls. No second message asking whether you listened. No pressure. No attempt to turn vulnerability into an obligation. Because if the apology was real, your boundary had to remain yours. The next morning, the suitcase was closed. The room looked strangely empty. Your soulmate picked up the phone once before leaving. There was no dramatic certainty about what waited on the screen. Maybe you listened. Maybe you hadn't yet. Maybe you needed time. Maybe hearing their voice brought back feelings you had worked hard to settle. Maybe it gave you a piece of clarity. Maybe it changed nothing about the decision you had already made. All of those possibilities had to be respected. Because the deepest meaning of that voice message was never whether you immediately responded. It was that the old relationship could no longer continue exactly as it had. You had changed. And if your soulmate ever hoped to meet you again emotionally, they would have to change too. Not because tears proved they were ready. Not because leaving suddenly made them realize your value. Not because a powerful connection erased everything that happened. But because love, when it becomes mature, eventually asks for more than feeling. It asks for honesty when hiding would be easier. It asks for consistency after the emotional moment has passed. It asks for the courage to accept boundaries without calling them rejection. It asks people to stop demanding that someone else keeps suffering while they decide whether they are ready to grow. Perhaps prayer will become part of that growth. Perhaps distance will teach lessons that closeness could not. Perhaps forgiveness will eventually arrive. Perhaps it will look like reconciliation. Perhaps it will simply look like peace. Neither possibility makes the love meaningless. Sometimes the purpose of a relationship is not proven by whether two people remain together forever. Sometimes its meaning is revealed by what both people finally become after being forced to face themselves. And now that old voice note from you carries a completely different meaning. You once said stepping back wasn't the same as not caring. Your soulmate finally knows that. But there is another truth they are only beginning to understand. Caring is not the same as returning. Forgiving is not the same as forgetting. Missing someone is not the same as being ready for them. And love does not ask you to become smaller so another person can feel secure. So whether that message becomes the beginning of another conversation or simply the first honest ending the two of you ever received, one thing has changed permanently. You are no longer standing in the same place where they left you. If they ever come toward you again, they cannot come expecting the old version of your heart. They will have to meet the person who learned that peace is precious. The person who can care without chasing. The person who can forgive without surrendering every boundary. The person who finally understands that the strongest proof of love is not how desperately someone cries when they fear losing you. It is whether they can become honest, steady, and respectful enough that loving them no longer requires you to lose yourself.